Good evening, and welcome to our weekly Torah Sparks, tidbits on the Parsha, the weekly Torah portion. The Torah portion's title itself tells us something about the content of the Parsha. The name Bo, come. In the text it says, God says to Moshe, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh. And the question is asked, why does it say, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh? It should have said, as it does in earlier sections, Lech el Paro, go to Pharaoh. You usually use the term Bo when you're talking about someone coming to you, not when you're going to someone else. And the Zohar answers that when Moshe had to go to Pharaoh and was outside of his palace, Moshe was not afraid of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was not in his strength. He was not in his own environment. But when he had to go into his palace, and not just in the palace, but in the innermost sanctum of his palace, when he had to be in the most powerful place in Egypt, and Pharaoh being the leader of Egypt, which was then the leading country in the world, this was the most powerful place in the world, in the negative sense of power, and Moshe was terrified, the Zohar says. So God says to him, Bo, come with me to Pharaoh. I will go with you. This is the simple understanding of the Zohar, but there's also a deeper understanding that there's a spiritual dynamic that is going on over here. Moshe is not just going to a tyrant called Pharaoh, but everything in the Torah that exists on the level of Pshat, on the simple level, on the even other deeper levels, has a parallel in a mystical level. That the word paro, according to the Zohar, comes from a root that means exposed, where all of the deepest spiritual energies are exposed. And Moses felt that he could not absorb such powerful spiritual energy. And God says, come with me, I will enable you to do this. And this really encapsulates what the whole process of the Exodus was about, because the Exodus was about getting the Jewish people liberated from Egypt so they can receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the purpose of Torah, ultimately, is to bring together heaven and earth. No matter how high, no matter how sublime the spiritual energy, the godly energy is, it can be contained by and received by the physical creatures here on earth. And in order to set the tone for that, God says to Moshe, come with me, I will reveal myself and be with you and enable you and empower you to absorb these greatest spiritual powers. And in our own day and age, there are people who are afraid of evil. We can understand that. But there are also people who are afraid of their own shadow. They're afraid of their own spiritual power. They're afraid of their own abilities. It's daunting and intimidating. And God says that should not allow you to fear. I will give you the power to internalize it, to harness it, and to implement it in your life. So God says to Moshe, speak to Pharaoh, come to Pharaoh, and give him a warning, which is the introduction to the last three plagues. Why are these three plagues separated from the other seven? Because these three plagues, on a simple level, are the most devastating plagues, except for the one of darkness. But we can talk about two sides and two angles even about darkness. But let's start off with the plague of locusts. All of the other plagues caused damage. It terrified the people. It even killed some people. But it left intact their major supply of existence, their food. The next plague, Arbel, locusts, was going to destroy and consume everything, which would, of course, put Egypt in a state of famine, could destroy the entire country. That's the 8th plague. The 10th plague, we'll skip the 9th for a moment. The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. Obviously, every household had a firstborn, and this didn't have to be firstborn consistent with halacha, with Jewish law that talks about the laws of firstborn with regard to redeeming the firstborn. This was any firstborn. There could have been several in one household would die that night in one instant, and that included Pharaoh's own crown prince. And Pharaoh himself thought that he was going to be a victim of that plague as well. So these are the two most difficult plagues. What about the plague of darkness? So there are two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it, yes, darkness was also the most terrifying plague, and psychologically it had the greatest damage, because when there's total darkness to the point where they could even touch the darkness, darkness became such a reality that it created such fear, psychological torture that lasted for 6 days. There's nothing comparable to that, because a person could become accustomed to physical difficulty, to physical pain even. You could internalize it and find a way of absorbing it, but the terror that they were given, that was instilled in them during this plague, was unbearable. But according to our sages, there was another reason for this plague of darkness. This plague of darkness was intended for two reasons. Reason number one was God wanted the Jews to take the wealth of Egypt with them. So when the Jews would ask the Egyptians, before they would leave, to give them their gold, their silver, their clothing, the Egyptians would of course say, well, we don't have any of that. We're not rich. We don't have gold and silver. And the Jews would say, well, we were in your homes during the plague of darkness, and we discovered where you keep all your treasures. And of course, then they would not be able to withhold it from them. That's one explanation. Another explanation is, and it's a sad one, that the truth is that not all the Jews wanted to leave Egypt. Many of them were comfortable, in quotation marks, of course, because they were slaves. But that's, again, part of human nature, that you're afraid of the unknown. You feel comfortable. This is your home. This is where you grew up. This is your life. And you don't know of anything better. And you're afraid to embark on a new venture. And they wanted to stay in Egypt. And God says, well, if that's their desire, they will have to pass away in Egypt, so that the Egyptians should not feel the Jews are suffering as well. They all died in the plague of darkness and were buried there, so the Egyptians never discovered that the Jews also suffered a loss of a major part of their population. The question is, why did these people not go out of Egypt? Why didn't God just take them out together with all the rest of the Jewish people? And if you say, well, they were not righteous, the fact they didn't want to go out shows that they didn't care to get the Torah. Well, there were many Jews who were not righteous who got out of Egypt. There were Jews who were worshipping of idols. Micha is one of the idol worshippers, and he also crossed the Red Sea, and he also left Egypt with everyone else. God says, I'm taking you all out. So why were these Jews different? And the Rebbe explains that the basis for the Exodus, especially for Jews who were not really deserving and worthy, was the fact that God was taking the Jews into his embrace and calling them my children. B'ni b'chori Yisro, God says to Pharaoh through Moses, my firstborn child Israel. And a parent accepts his child unconditionally. And therefore God says, whether they're worthy, whether they're not worthy, I will take them out. But the Jews who didn't want to leave made a declaration that we do not want to be part of God's family, as it were. We do not want to have that distinct relationship with God. If that's the case, how could their relationship save them when they didn't even want the relationship? The Rebbe coins an expression, actually it's an expression of the Talmud, but he applies it to this: Ein kateger nasa seneger. The prosecutor cannot become the defender. The very sin of not wanting to be a child cannot be the defender. Perhaps we could use the contemporary example of the person who kills his parents and begs the court for mercy because he's an orphan. You can't use the crime as the force that gets you out of punishment. But the Rebbe then adds, that was true before we got the Torah. But once we got the Torah, there is no way that any Jew, regardless of his desire to be part of the Jewish people or not, that will stay in exile. Every Jew will be taken out of this exile with Mashiach. No Jew will be left behind, because once we got the Torah, God connected himself to every Jew. When God gives the Torah and he says, I am Lord your God, in English there's no difference in translation, but in the Hebrew, the word your God, and likewise all the other commandments, is in the singular, because God has put himself into the soul and consciousness of every individual Jew, to the point where a Jew can never sever his or her relationship with God, even if they want to, and therefore every Jew will be liberated. It's only our task to help reveal that connection, so that the Jew leaves Egypt, leaves exile, not in spite of himself, but because of himself. Another thing about the plague of darkness, it says one did not see his fellow. There's a very important moral lesson to know that at the end of exile, the 10 plagues are essentially the plagues that ended the Egyptian exile, so we could use a parallel, or draw a parallel to our own situation when we're trying to get out of this exile, that before the ultimate plague that breaks the back of exile, the penultimate plague is that we don't see each other. There's a darkness that prevails, and we don't recognize the other because there's simply no appreciation for the light that exists within, the soul that exists within the other. We have to recognize that that division that exists within the Jewish community, within the world, is one of the negative characteristics of exile. And this is unfortunately the sign, a negative sign, that we're closer to the end. There are many positive and negative signs about the period right before the redemption. In the Talmud it talks about how there will be division between generations, and how, on the other hand, there'll be a lot of positive things going on. So one of the negatives is that one does not see his brother. We have to recognize that that's one of the things that we have to correct. Okay, so now the 10th plague occurs, and of course Pharaoh summons Moses and begs him to leave with the Jewish people. But before they leave, God speaks to Moses, tell the Jewish people to give them a commandment. This is the first commandment. If you ever have anyone ask you, what is the first commandment? There are several answers to that question. One answer is the first commandment in the Torah is be fruitful and multiply. That's in Genesis, the beginning of Genesis. You'd be correct if you answered that. You'd also be correct if you said the first commandment is the first of the 10, so-called 10 commandments. I am the Lord your God who is taking you out of the land of Egypt. That's the first of the communication at Mount Sinai. But you'd also be correct if you'd say that the first commandment is the one that appears in chapter 12, verse 2, where God says to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, and this is what he says, verse 2, this month shall be for you the beginning of the months. It shall be for you the first of the months of the year. This is the first commandment, which is about establishing a Jewish calendar. Now, the Jewish calendar is not a text that we follow as the way it is today. That was introduced about 1,500 years ago. But before then, and ultimately in the Messianic age, we'll go back to the system of declaring a new moon month by month. And that is declared by the Sanhedrin, or their representatives, who are specially ordained and empowered to declare the beginning of a new month based on the testimony of witnesses, cross-examination of the witnesses, because the judges have to be astronomers, so they have to know exactly the position of the moon and whether the witnesses were telling the truth or not. And then after they are satisfied with the testimony of the witnesses, the Sanhedrin, the rabbis, the judges declare that day or the next day to be the first of the new month. The reason they would do it the next day is because they didn't get witnesses to testify. It was a cloudy night, or the witness's testimony was deemed to be faulty, it was not corroborated. So then the next day would become Rosh Chodesh. So there was a toss-up of 2 days, and depending on when they declared Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, that's when we would celebrate the holidays. For example, if the first of the month of Tishrei, the month in which we have the high holy days, was, let's say, on a Sunday, then Yom Kippur would be 10 days later. But if it was Monday, then Yom Kippur would be 11 days later, and that could mess up people's entire schedules if they didn't know when the first of the month was. And that's the reason why we keep an extra day, because in the olden days they couldn't notify everyone about it. They didn't have modern methods of communication. So people who lived far away from Israel would add on an extra day to the holiday just in case the courts delayed the first of the month to the next day. We're not going to go into all the details of this law, just to focus on the spiritual concept behind this. Here we're talking about time. No philosophy of life that I know of has such a profound understanding of time, and how time is not just something we pass through, it's something we work on. It's something that exists and is placed in our lap, so to speak, for us to cultivate, for us to refine, for us to react to, for us to respond to. We're very sensitive to time in Judaism. We're sensitive to sunrise and sunset. We're sensitive to weekdays and Shabbos. We're sensitive to holidays and cycles within the week, within the month, within the year, within 7 years, within 50 years. Time is an extremely important commodity in Judaism. And we have the power, through this commandment, to affect time. That's one of the most powerful messages of what Torah is all about. Torah is about taking everything in this world and making it holy, whether it's physical objects that occupy space, whether it's people, personalities, or whether it's time. Those are the three things that make up the whole world, as is mentioned in the earliest works of Kabbalah, the Sefer Yetzirah, that everything is divided into either olam, space, shana, time, nefesh, energy, life, whatever. And this is one example where Judaism has the ability to elevate even time, and we are in control of that. And that explains one of the reasons why the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, when they wanted to undermine Judaism, they decreed against the establishment of the new moon, because they could not tolerate the concept that we have the power to alter nature. They deified nature. We do not deify nature. We are believers that nature is placed in our hands to refine, elevate, and sometimes to change. That's why we have circumcision, which changes the appearance of the body. And we have so many other commandments that are there to alter nature. Nature does not mean that it is good. Nature is not synonymous with God. God created nature, and he wants us to improve on it. But that's a long discussion, so we'll leave that for another time. It's interesting that the words, HaChodesh Hazel Lachem, this month is unto you, those three Hebrew words, numerically, if you add them up, because in Hebrew every letter is also a number, it adds up to the phrase, Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the son or descendant of David. What is that? How does that connect to the new moon? The Jewish people are likened to the moon. The moon waxes, but it wanes. The Messianic age is explained by way of metaphor that it's the time when the moon will no longer wane. The Jewish people's ability to reflect the light of the sun, which is the metaphor for the light of God, will not be diminished at any time. so that whenever we sanctify, we see a new moon, that gives us new hope that this month, this period of time will be different, and we will be able to greet Mashiach, and it'll be a world of total godliness and goodness that will not wane at all. Now, God also commands them to bring the Paschal offering, to sprinkle the blood on their doorposts, to be circumcised. And in this initial instruction that God gives Moses, telling him what to tell the Jewish people, how to prepare for the Exodus, he also prepares them for their future. And he says, if your children will ask you, what is it that you're doing over here? You should tell them that God took us out of Egypt. And the way the Torah, this is at the end of the section, of the entire Parsha, chapter 13, verse 14. And it shall be when your son will ask you at some future time, what is this? You shall say to him, with a strong hand, God removed us from Egypt, from the house of bondage. Very interesting, Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs, points out that if you were the founder of a new nation and you're talking to your people just as they are about to be liberated, what would you talk about? You would talk about freedom. You would talk about the struggles. You would talk about your destination, the land of milk and honey. And here, what does God talk about besides the laws and the commandments and all the nuances and all the what you can consider to be, what some would consider to be trivial, although nothing is trivial, of course, in God's commandments. But you wouldn't be talking about the distant future. But that's exactly what makes Judaism unique, that it's about education and it's about the future. If we would have focused, as other nations have, on their own accomplishments of the present, and we wouldn't have planned for the future through education, then of course there would be no Jewish people. We would never have survived. So this parsha underscores the importance of education of our youth. And it is also the primary theme of the night of Passover. The Seder night revolves around the children asking questions. And this is another incredible thing. Most religious dogmas want you to accept what they teach on faith, and Judaism is no exception. Faith is the foundation of Judaism. But Judaism goes to the next step and says, now that you have the faith, question, ask questions, learn. Don't just do things because you're told to do them. That's great, that's wonderful that you have the ability to submit yourself to a higher authority, and no one is undermining and minimizing the power of faith, but that's not enough. You have to have answers to questions, and you have to keep on asking those questions, and that's the whole theme of the Seder night, with the 4 questions, which are only a sample of the many questions that we're supposed to entertain and try to respond to at the Seder night. Now, when the Torah says, when your sons will ask you, it says tomorrow. The Hebrew word tomorrow, machar. So Rashi says, the major commentator, that machar, the word for tomorrow, could have 2 meanings. It could mean literally tomorrow, or it could mean in the future. So the Rebbe gives a very beautiful interpretation of these 2 different possibilities. We're talking about the future, obviously, but there's a future that's connected to the present, or to the past, and there's a future that's detached from it. Most ideologies and most people feel that the passage of time requires the passage of your way of thinking. Modern people should not think the way ancient people used to think. And it happens to be true in most cases. We don't want to repeat the excesses of any of the empires of the past, whether it's the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian, Assyrian, Philistine Empire, Spanish Empire, and British Empire, and all the other empires, Soviet Union. We don't want to repeat their mistakes, but there's one empire that we dare not sever our ties from, and that's God's empire. That is the empire of Judaism. That is something that we don't want to change. Nothing in Judaism has to change. Yes, we'll use computers to teach Torah, as we're doing right now. That changed, but not the content of what is being taught cannot be changed. But what happens inevitably is that with the future comes people who forget about the past. They're living in a future world severed from the past. And there are some people who, no matter how far they progress, chronologically speaking, they still live in the past in terms of the eternal and enduring values of the Torah. So when a father is supposed to be responding to his children, one could think, don't waste your time on the modern generation, the people who feel that we are living in a new generation severed from the past. Whether you translate the word machar as literally tomorrow or a tomorrow that's in the distant future, either way you have a responsibility to that child. This is in line with the Rebbe's pervasive philosophy that we do not give up on any Jew, that we reach every Jew, even the Jew who is completely beyond the pale. That Jew too can be reached and brought back into the fold. Now we know that the source of Passover comes from this week's portion where God passed over. The Hebrew word Pesach means passing over. Why? Because the night of the 10th plague, the Jews were supposed to put blood on the doorposts, the blood from the Paschal offering, and God passed over their homes, smote, I thought I had to get that word in there, smote the Egyptians, but spared the Jews. Now, the word Pesach, Rashi says, has another meaning. It means compassion. So one meaning is, I will pass over their homes, and the other meaning is, I will have compassion. And what compels Rashi to give that alternate translation? Because it's a little bit difficult to picture God having to jump over a home. God is not physical, and the idea, the imagery of jumping over is a little bit remote. The Torah wouldn't use an expression like that. The Torah could have said it in a better way. You know, I will not smite the Jews. What does he have to say? I'll pass over their homes. So Rashi therefore concludes that there's a deeper meaning, and it means compassion. But yet, the word does mean passing over. So the explanation in Hasidic thought is that what is the message, or what is the meaning of compassion? Compassion means you may not be worthy. It could be that if I followed strict justice, if I followed the system that God put into this world, where good begets good, evil begets evil, sin begets punishment, good deeds generate reward, tit for tat, everything follows a strict system, the Jews may not have succeeded in being liberated from Egypt. Why? Because as the Medrash says, the angels complained to God during the splitting of the sea, why are you sparing the Jews and letting the Egyptians drown? Elu ve'elu oivdi avodah zarah hain. These are idolaters and these are idolaters. The Jews did degenerate to the point where they did worship idols. Not all the Jews, but many of them, enough of them, to warrant the accusation that God was being not fair. He's killing the Egyptians for their sins, and he's sparing the Jews. So if it was God's attribute of justice, his system, that would have dominated, they would not have been liberated. They would not have been spared the 10th plague. So what did God do? He shows compassion. Compassion means he transcends, or he overrides his system. The system says, don't save them, and God says, I will save them. That's the meaning of he passes over. Not, God forbid, in a spatial sense of jumping over, but in a spiritual, emotional sense, you pass over your emotions that tell you to not be kind to someone. Your emotions say, that person doesn't deserve it. And your spirit of compassion says, I am capable of passing over my own system of judgment, even though it may be solid and rational and founded on good sound reasons. I will override it. I will transcend it and not submit to what my system of logic dictates. And I will be nice and kind to that person. So we could translate this in our own lives as well. Another example of how God did not discriminate and how we should not discriminate and not give up hope on any Jew. It says that the plague, Rashi explains, affected all the Egyptians, but if a Jew was not in his home, so God could have passed over it, but he wasn't there, he was with his friends in the Egyptian home, he would have also been spared. And that is another message, a similar message that runs through many of the Rebbe's teachings, that even the Jew who's totally assimilated, he is still a Jew, and God will protect him and keep him in his fold. The only exceptions were then, as we discussed before, those who didn't want to leave Egypt. They didn't want to be loved by God and accepted by God. That was before the Torah was given. Then it was still possible to opt out of becoming part of the Jewish people. But even that doesn't exist anymore. Once the Torah was given, as I mentioned before, every Jew was part of the Jewish fold. And I'll conclude with one other interesting interpretation of the words of the Haggadah that we say Passover night. On Passover night, we speak to the four sons, the wise son, the wicked son, the simple son, and the one who doesn't even know how to ask questions. But what's most intriguing is what we tell the wicked son. It sounds pretty harsh. The wicked son starts off by saying, what is all this work that you're doing? And he says with emphasis, you, what are you doing? As if I'm not part of it. I don't want to be part of your whole spiel, of your whole Seder, of your whole commemoration of the Exodus. I'm not part of the Jewish community. That's what it sounds like. And what do we tell him? We blunt his teeth, and we tell him, if he would have been there, if you would have been there, you would not have been redeemed. Isn't that pretty harsh? So the Rebbe, in his own inimical way, it's not the right way of pronouncing it, but you know what I mean, inimitable way, the Rebbe explains that, on the contrary, it's a very positive thing. It sounds harsh. Sometimes you have to use a little tough rhetoric, but there has to be some honey inside that rhetoric. And what is the honey over here? You're saying, if you would have been there, if you would have lived at the time of the Exodus, you would not have been redeemed. Because just like those Jews who didn't want to leave were not liberated, you too, who don't feel part of the Jewish people, you would have stayed behind, because that was one prerequisite. You could have been a bad Jew, you were still let out. But if you don't want to be a Jew, you don't want to be part of the community, then you were forced to stay behind and then perish in Egypt, as we discussed before. But now, there you would not have gone out. But now, you have no choice. You're a Jew, you will go out with us. By hook or by crook, you will be liberated from this exile. You are part of the Jewish people. We will never give up on you. That's the eternal message from this week's Parsha, that the Jewish people are God's people, and we don't belong in Egypt. We don't belong in exile. We were in exile for too long, and this is the week that we can focus and say to God, enough is enough. We're ready to leave the exile and to greet Mashiach. I I just want to add that this week is a very special week. Sunday night, Monday, is the 10th day of Shvat. That's the anniversary of the passing of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, of sainted memory. And it's the day when his successor obviously assumed the leadership, even though he formally accepted it a year later. But we don't have a generation without a leader, and assumed the leadership of the Jewish people. And the Rebbe's whole life and thousands of pages of teaching revolved around this singular theme of doing everything in our power to unite the Jewish people, unite them with the teachings of Torah and the observance of the mitzvahs, paving the way for the ultimate redemption, and that we are now on the very threshold of that era, and all it takes is for us to do one more mitzvah. Let's hope that that mitzvah we have fulfilled tonight by learning some Torah, and we will be together with Mashiach imminently in Yerushalayim.